Well, like I said, this isn't going to be a whole hour long, so hopefully, there'll be time for questions at the end, or you'll get a little bit of your hour back to your life. So talking about writing great letters of recommendation. And first of all, I want to say I don't see myself as an expert in this, but it is something that I think I just have some experience in both talking to students and talking to graduate schools and talking to faculty. And I've tried to kind of bring all of that together and talk about ways you might go about this. And so just as an overview of what we're going to talk about, we'll first talk a little bit about, from the graduate school side, what are they expecting to see in letters? And a few little, this is what we're not expecting, and sometimes we do see these things. And then what do our students expect from us? What do I write? So just a few little tips, maybe some direction to get you started. And then finally, where can I find help? And I've listed just a couple of resources that I found, and they're embedded into this. And of course, Misty will share this with people, and so you'll just be able to click on those links. So first of all, what do graduate schools expect? So when we think about an entire student's application, they've got their personal statement that they've turned in, they've got their transcript that they've turned in, they've got their CV or a resume that they've turned in. And so the graduate school already knows a lot from the student's perspective and some quantitative data that they can use to come up with who they think the student is. And so then they've got typically 3 letters of recommendation that they ask for that just give them a little bit more information about the student. So what they really want to hear from us is not, this is the best student I've ever had, but much more about how will this student be successful in graduate school? Because graduate schools, as we all know, are basically taking a risk on a student being able to complete work at the next level. And it's much more graduate students reflect the quality of the program much more than an undergraduate student might. And so, if you're putting out your bio, you typically don't list all of the places that you went to school. You talk about where you went to graduate school, right? And so you as a student are aligned more with that school's branding. And so they expect a student to be able to come in and be a strong student and complete. And so one of the first things that they're looking for in a letter would be uniqueness. So just like with a personal statement, when we talk with students about building a personal statement, we tell them, emphasize that thing about you that's going to stand out. So that, start with that opening story that's going to make someone go, oh, well, this is not the typical student, or this was not the typical experience. And so when you are thinking about writing a letter for a student, that's something that you should think about too. What was it about this student that made them stand out in the classroom? Or what was it, maybe they had a different perspective, maybe they were a single mom or something like that. So what is it about the student that makes them unique? There's also an element of uniqueness in that, if you think about it, a student might give 3 letters of recommendation, and a lot of times those 3 letters are going to say exactly the same thing. So if your letter can say something maybe that another letter won't say, that gives the graduate school more information to make a better decision. Also, things like being an athlete, being an RA, show the graduate school, this student can not only handle the academic rigor, we see in their transcript, but they balanced being an athlete, or they also weren't trusted enough to be an RA. And even though the student may say that in their personal statement, you saying it from the perspective of a faculty member, like them being a student athlete in no way impeded their success in my classes, that is a really good thing to point out. Specificity. This is probably, when I talk to graduate schools, this is probably the #1 thing that they say that faculty do not do. They are not specific about how a student is academically strong. So they'll just say, well, this student, you know, was an academic star in my class. Well, in what way? Did they just write at a different kind of level? Were they able to be a classroom leader, you know, in a small group situation? Did they understand concepts more quickly? Did they take on extra work because they were just super interested in that topic? So if you can be very specific about why a student is academically strong, that again helps the graduate school to make a good decision, right? Another thing that I've heard from graduate schools is consistency. So I don't know how many graduate school or letters of preferences that you've done, but a very common format is for the graduate school to send you a form, and at the beginning of the form, you're supposed to rate the student. So the top 5%, the top, you know, that kind of rating system. And sometimes they'll get that, and so maybe you've rated the student in so you've got like the outstanding, which is the top 5%, and then there's like the next 25, the next 25. So you've maybe rated the student in mostly the second or third tier, and you think you're pretty good, right? Then you write this letter, and this letter is like, this is one of the best students we've ever had. And so then the graduate school's like, okay, then why didn't you mark all in the top? You know, so there needs to be consistency between the way that you rate them and your letter. And that's something that a lot of graduate schools have said to me, that's just such a weird thing that they see from faculty, not really understanding that those two things really need to complement one another. So if you do rate them on the 3, then maybe there should be things in your letter that say an area of growth for this student would be this, right? That would be consistent with what that rating system is. So unusual circumstances. Graduate schools are not only interested in academic potential, as I've already said, but in the potential that a student has to persevere. So the other thing is, let's say that you know that a student has had a really difficult semester because their dad passed away, or you know they had some sort of physical illness, or you know some sort of drama in their life, and so the graduate school has the personal statement and the transcript. Personal statement tells one story, the transcript tells another story. So in the personal statement, the student may try to address issues with their transcript, but you have to be very careful as a student to not make it sound like you are making excuses for yourself or something like that. And so a letter of recommendation is a great way to help a student to describe those unusual circumstances, how they overcame them, and how they were successful from a faculty perspective. And I actually have an example of that. We had a student a few years ago with an F on their transcript. Very embarrassed by that. Very, very did not feel like that was the student's best work, and it wasn't. But it was just one of those things, and there was no way for the student to retake the course because it was one of those courses that she could not retake it. So a faculty member wrote as part of their letter an explanation of that for the graduate school to try to help the graduate school understand from a faculty perspective, yeah, this student has this grade, but that is not at all indicative of the student's performance over long term in the major and in the discipline. That's students in a PhD program. So, you know, I think those kinds of things can really, really help us from the faculty perspective. The other thing I want to talk about are these 3 phrases. So these 3 phrases, sometimes the graduate school will ask for one of these. Do you strongly recommend? Do you recommend? Do you recommend with reservations? I would say if you're going to say recommend with reservations, make sure you tell the student that before you write the letter. But even with recommend, if a graduate school is looking at, it's a very competitive spot, and they've got two of their 3 letters, or even 3 letters that all say recommend and don't say strongly recommend, that's going to be a red flag to them. But we might not know that as faculty. We might not have the experience or even understand that to know if I don't put that word strongly in there, that actually harms the student just a little bit. And so when you're thinking about the way that you speak about the student, if you feel like you can strongly recommend, then you should put, I strongly recommend this. And you should start your letter with that, and then have that be part of the last sentence as well, to have that strongly recommend language in there.
Yeah, sometimes I'll say I recommend without reservation.
Yeah, exactly.
At the end of the letter, is that okay?
Yeah, I think so.
Better way to say that.
Yeah, no, I think that's the same meaning as strongly recommend, for sure. Yeah. I did strongly recommend just less words. I'm not an English person, so. All right. So then, what do our students expect from us? They come to you. They ask you to write a letter, and what are they expecting you to do for them? First of all, they expect honesty. So there's a couple ways in which they expect honesty. They expect you to say, no, I cannot write you a letter of recommendation. That is honest. There are probably students that we have all had that if they came to us were like, my experience with you has just not been as positive as maybe another professor, and it might be better for you. We actually had a student who had burned quite a few bridges and asked a faculty member to write a letter. We tell our students, when you ask a faculty member to write a letter, you need to ask them, are you willing to write me a strong letter of recommendation? This student chose not to ask it in that way, and just by email asked for a letter of recommendation. And the faculty member said, yes, I'll write you a letter of recommendation. And it was not a strong letter. And she didn't get in. She got into another program because she didn't ask that particular professor to write her letter. But I understand where the professor was coming, because he was a little bit frustrated. I mean, she didn't even ask in person and all of that. But I still think at the end of the day, the most honest thing would have been for him to say, I don't know that you really want me to write a letter of recommendation for you. Because just because you've had a bad experience with them doesn't mean every professor's had a bad experience with them. And so give another professor an opportunity to write a letter for the student. There are some students who cannot get good letters of recommendation. That's fair too. And that's honest, right? So anyway, the other thing is be honest with them if you know you can't turn it in on time. And that's the next thing. Students expect us to be timely. So first of all, if they do request, my hope is that any student who would ever ask you for a letter of recommendation asks you face-to-face. That is my hope. That doesn't always happen. And sometimes it's just not possible. Like your schedule and their schedule never match, where you can't actually be, especially if they're not in any of your classes or anything like that. I'm especially thinking about adult students as well. They're here from 6 to 10. We're here from 8 to 5. It's difficult maybe to connect with those students. So if they send you an email asking you, please respond quickly, but also turn them in on time. There is one of the things that we tell our McNair students all the time is everything that is not reliant on you to get done, you need to check it and check it and check it and check it. And so all those emails that they're sending you, they're frantic because they've done all of their work. They want to respect you. They obviously have a good relationship with you, but you're making them have a nervous breakdown because their letters are not in and they can see it, right? And so just this week, one of our students came, he had gotten into a program, and he said that there's this weird thing that they said in my acceptance. And so I pull it up and it reads, and it says, we still need your final transcript once you've gotten your bachelor's degree, and then we need your final letter of reference. And he was like, I don't know what happened, because I asked these two professors and they said they would do it. And I know the professors, and like, I was really surprised that they hadn't done it. And sure enough, he goes back to them, and that particular system had a save button and a submit button. Mm-hmm. And so she had saved it, but hadn't actually hit submit. Oh, no. And so, and this system didn't tell him that his letters had gotten in or not. And so, and it was easily fixed. All she had to do is go back in and log in and hit submit. And fortunately, this graduate school was flexible enough that they didn't matter. But for some schools, the 3 letters aren't in by the due date, they don't look at your application.
I mean, they usually send you a receipt.
Right.
And so if faculty should expect the receipt.
They should, yeah. But again, I mean, it's a lot of, this is a very, very busy time of year, and, just thinking about all of that stuff. And this is also a busy time of year where, our professors, especially in psych and in the sciences, they're writing maybe 10, 12 letters of recommendation and trying to keep track of all of that. That's a, that could be a little part-time job, So yeah, go ahead. Did you have a?
No, I was just saying, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And again, be honest. If you don't have the time to do it, don't do it. Just tell them, I would love to write you a letter, but I'm looking at the rest of my semester and I'm looking at your due date and I just can't fit that in, students also expect the letters to be personalized. What that doesn't mean, so, a McNair student, I'll just use that because we make them, a McNair student comes to you and says, I'm applying to 10 schools, would you write me a letter? That does not mean that you necessarily have to write 10 highly individualized letters. You can kind of come up with the core of one and then maybe switch it out a little bit, right? But it does need to be Jocelyn's letter, Christy's letter, right? It's not just female student insert here, right? And I don't think any of us would do that, but students want to know that when the graduate school reads that letter, they're learning more about who they are, because that's all they've got. There are very few programs now outside of psych, really, that do a bunch of interviews because they just don't have the resources to bring those in. They'll bring them in when it's down to the 5, right? But you want your student to get to that 5, and the only way they can do that is through the personalized letters. I also want to insert in here having students write their own letters. Interestingly enough, that's apparently more common than I thought. Sorry, my nose is running.
So you're saying the students are writing letters and
right. So the faculty member saying, well, I'd love to write you that letter, but I don't really have time to do it. Why don't you write it, and then I'll just put in a few of my touches. So that's really bad.
No better way to
but it's common, surprisingly common. I first heard about that from the graduate recruiter at Stanford, that he had been talking to a student, and the student was like, yeah, my professor just told me to write my letter, and that then he would just look it over and make the, and has that happened to you? Yeah. That's not good.
On this campus?
No. Oh. No. And I actually don't think that's something that would happen on this campus because our faculty know our students so well. Mm-hmm. But try to avoid that if at all possible.
The only thing that I think would make sense though for some students, like for the pre-health, mm-hmm. Even though I know them on some level, not in their everyday lives, mm-hmm. I mean, I do ask them to give me some feedback, give me some information.
Absolutely.
And I was just wondering, maybe that student, maybe that's what it was, and maybe that's how that student interpreted it.
Right. Well, I mean, Jocelyn was asked to actually write her letter.
Yeah, like specifically, like, I mean, this was not for like this was for a job. And so I was like, hey, do you have time to do this? And they were like, you know what, if you could just write it for me and then email it to me and then I'll email it to them. And so they're like, because they wanted to add in like their signature line. And I was like, am I supposed to do that? I mean, I know that it has happened for me like professionally.
Wow.
And so, I mean,
But I think it's happened, I think it's been more than just that. I think it's really been like, well, I just don't really have time to write that. Or, well, I don't remember what class you were in and, you know, all of that. And so, and part of that is, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute, but, you know, getting a student CV and their personal statement and all that, and having that in front of you so that you can remember, okay, oh yeah, I did have you as a sophomore, and yeah, because it is hard to remember exactly how the student performs in your class. The next thing is students expect you to be accurate. They expect you to spell their name correctly, right, Jocelyn? She had that happen to her. To get their program right. So, you know, I mean, seriously, you know, I'm so excited that this student has applied for your Master of Science in Biochemistry, and this graduate school's like, we don't have that program. You know, it happens. Check and double check. Also, if you're writing multiple letters for the same student, like I said, totally fine to have the same core. I mean, you know, how else can you can't write 10 completely different letters, right? But be very careful about double checking that you changed, you know, the university's name or the program or professor that the student is excited about working with. You know, just be really, really careful about that. Of course, you know, we get on to our students all the time about that because personal statements are the same thing. We don't make them write 10 completely separate personal statements, but we do say if you're going to personalize it, make sure that you double and triple check that. There's also, well, I'll talk about that later. So responsiveness is the last thing that students expect from us. Respond quickly to the students' requests. Also, let them know that you've submitted the recommendation. That's really helpful for them. Even though they can log in, that's what I do too. I forward them a copy of the receipt that I get because then they have a date and time stamp. So that if anything ever came back like we never got that, they can say, no, here is the email that my professor got. So somehow it's a problem on your end, it's not a problem on our end. Of course, they'll say that in a very respectful, nice way. But be very responsive to them. Remember how you felt the fall semester of your senior year when you were applying for graduate school, or whenever it was that you were applying for graduate school. Remember how anxious you were, and you're trying to balance all of that other stuff, and you're also this kind of part-time job of applying to graduate school, and that whole feeling like no one's going to want to accept me, everyone hates me. That is such a time of anxiety. And if they're also waiting on you to do what you're supposed to do, that just adds to their level. So be very responsive to them. All right, so I have a few tips that I've gotten from graduate schools, from students, and that I just kind of come up with my own. One of the things that we coach our students to do this, but I don't know that every student thinks about it this way. Like I said before, a graduate school is getting 3 letters, and 80% of the time, those 3 letters say the exact same thing. And so one of the things that we talk to our students about is to identify a research person, an academic person, and a leadership person. And so when we tell the students, okay, who's the person who supervised your research? Go and ask them to write a letter about your capacity for research. They might talk about other things as well, but to focus in on that. And then you have the professor that you had 3 classes with. So have them talk about your academic potential in the classroom. And then you have your academic advisor, that person that you got really close to. Have them talk about your ability to be a leader in the field, scholarly leadership. And they might not have all of those 3, and so they might double up on an area. But when you are talking to a student, ask them, what is it that you would like for me specifically to focus on? How do you see our relationship? Where do you see that I can most positively talk about you? So let's say that you were their research mentor, but in your class, they didn't do that well. They really struggled with the content. You know they can be a super great researcher. You don't necessarily want to talk a whole lot about their performance in the class, right? Because you don't want to negatively hurt their chances, but you also don't feel like you can be on it. You know, you don't want to be dishonest. And so asking them that is a really good way to help you then make a letter that stands out, you know. So that's one tip. Try to avoid words like creative, brilliant, innovative. Those are so vague. Unless you can say the student was creative by blah, 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 right? So a very specific example to show a student showing creativity in the classroom or in their research or whatever. So really try to avoid those catch-all words. Because again, every student is brilliant, right? You're applying to grad school, you're brilliant. Yeah, so try to avoid those things. Give specific academic examples. Things like, you know, in this particular group project, this student went above and beyond in showing both leadership and academic ability by finding, you know, whatever it is, you know the ways in which a student has stood out academically in your classroom or in their research. And so be very, very specific about that and talk about in the, you know, world history class because those kinds of things show the graduate school that you know them very well and that they stood out enough that you still remember that, right? Ask the student to share their personal statement and their CV with you so that you can be consistent with what they are also telling the school. So, and that certainly doesn't mean that they should be the same. In fact, they shouldn't be the same. But you don't want to say anything in your letter that contradicts what the student has said in their personal statement. So you just want to be very careful about that and have that consistency across the board. This is something that I do. I come up with a central word or phrase that I use to describe the student. And so, you know, I might start off my letter. I'm writing to highly recommend or strongly recommend Jocelyn to the PhD in Public Affairs program at whatever university. If I was going to use one word to describe Jocelyn, it would be X. And then the rest of my letter, I try to continue to come back to that central word or phrase and give specific examples about how she shows that particular word or phrase. That's just an easy way, I think, to organize your letter and to make it, to keep you from rambling, right? I mean, you know, we all like to ramble. So, especially if you really like the student, right? Because you just have all of these things that you want to continue to talk about. So it helps me to keep it focused in on that one central word or phrase or idea. This seems to be a no-brainer, but spell check and proofread. I got a letter of recommendation from somebody for the grad assistant position here. So somebody on this campus that I highly respect is very good at writing letters. I've gotten multiple letters from this faculty member. And the faculty member described the student as contentious.
Whoa.
What do they mean?
Conscientious.
Oh,
So I happened to see the faculty member and I was like, so when you said this, did you mean this? And the faculty member was like, yes, I can't believe I did that. I proofread that multiple times, you know. So just, right, exactly. And yeah, things like that don't autocorrect, right? And so that is, you know, fortunately, I knew the recommender, you know, I had a relationship, but if she had sent that to a graduate school, that could have really harmed that student.
Oh,
yes.
She's very contentious, right? And it certainly wouldn't have been consistent with the rest of the letter because the rest of the letter was pretty glowing, right? So yeah, that was kind of a funny one. And set aside time. It takes time to write good letters of recommendation, especially if you're not, Gwen is a very seasoned letters of recommendation person, but I know she still takes the time, she still sets aside time. And so that then goes back to, if you don't have really multiple hours that you can write this student's letters, tell them no. Up front, tell them no. If they're just asking for 1 or 2, you're probably not going to have to spend multiple hours. But if they're wanting you to do for all 6 of their programs, that's going to take you hours, So, all right. So my last slide here are just a few resources. This one, UC Berkeley on their Career Center, they've got this 1-page guidelines for writing a letter for graduate school, for business school, and for law school, because those letters are all a little bit different. And so I just linked that here because I thought that would be a really good resource to just have. You might print it off and stick it in your letters of rec file or whatever you have, because most of us keep that. Or just keep it as a link. Another one is Penn State has 3 sample letters. And so you can go there and they're just PDF sample letters and go through and look at, and they're from the graduate school posted them. And so they're kind of like, these are some letters that we've received. And they, even on there, they have a little thing about, notice that the professor says this and this and this. And so it's a little bit of a how-to guide with samples that I think is really great. And then I also put on here your seasoned colleagues, because there are a lot of people on this campus who have been faculty for a long time. Gwen is a really good resource for this, that I'm sure wouldn't mind, the first couple times just glancing over and saying, hey, is this a good letter? If you're just not feeling as experienced as maybe some other people might be. So I'm sure there are plenty of other resources out there. If you Google, how do I write a good letter of recommendation, you're going to get lots and lots of hints. But these were just 2 that I felt like were small, succinct, and gave us some good information. So, questions?
Most recommendation letters, like when websites or when schools ask for them, they usually have a way for the faculty member to send them in.
Right.
What if you have a student that says, "Oh, just send them to me and I'll send them in"? Is it okay for me to ask? Well, actually, I prefer not that I have a problem with the student reading it, but I mean, what's the sort of the expectation of confidentiality around
Right. Well, what I usually tell students is, I usually say, well, I'm not going to do that.
Right.
But I also tell them it is better for you if I don't do that. Because the graduate school is under the expectation that you have not seen this. And it is better for you to remain true to that than for me to let you see this letter. I do know, though, some faculty who just by rule, they send a copy of the letter to their student just so that the student knows. But that is entirely up to the faculty member. Okay. I don't know that there are very many schools left that have that kind of where you can't go in and send that. Yeah. And I think in some ways, some of it is a training thing. By the time they're applying for grad school, I would hope that they would not ask you that. But I had a couple of freshmen this year who wanted me to write letters or, fill out the little form for them for NSI or for RA or whatever. And they're like, I'll just come by and pick it up. And so I feel like, okay, well, here's a teachable moment, and I just said, no, it's better for me and for you if I go ahead and just send this in, So that's kind of the way I sort of try to phrase it as, this is better for you, for me to do it this way. Yeah.
So we framed it. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, for myself, I know, just as a general rule, if I don't think that I can share letters with the student, then I'm not going to write it.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
That means I don't.
Yeah.
Feel like they're worth it.
Right. Well, and that's one of the things that I actually didn't talk about that I was just thinking about is, how do you talk about a student that, they do have some strong qualities, but there are also some reservations that you have. And again, that goes back to honesty, right?
Yeah.
And so I think because it's also your integrity, you know, in the political science world, Anthony, that's a small world, right? And so you don't necessarily want to send something into a graduate school that's glowing, and then the student gets there and they're like, Anthony Roden doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
Right. School you attended.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that then goes back maybe to that central idea or central theme. So if you say, you know, if I had to describe the student in one word or one phrase, it might be this. And these are some ways to do that. And then I will usually, if there's something that I really feel like, is the issue that I observe something that is going to cause them a problem in graduate school, right? Because that's key. If it's just something that you're like, well, that's kind of annoying, that doesn't need to be addressed, right? But if it is something where, you know, you have observed that as they get stressed, they tend to withdraw, right? That is a problem in graduate school, right? And so then you say something like, an area of growth that I am seeing in this student is blah, 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 and talk about, because they're going to be better at it when you're writing the letter than they were when you first observed it, just because they've grown, right? And so you might say an area of growth that I've noticed for this student would be X, and I know they will continue to grow through the graduate school process or something like that, so that you have addressed it, but still try to put as much of a positive spin on it as possible. Because it's, you know, I mean, it's the same thing with us. If we call references for people that are working for us or read letters of recommendation, and all of them are like, this was the best employee that I've ever had, you're like, was it?
Yeah.
Like, you're not really confident if everybody says, you know, there's nothing that a previous employer says was wrong with it, because none of us are perfect employees, and none of our students are perfect students, right? And so that's one of the things that's kind of how I would phrase it, and that's actually how graduate schools have said that's the most positive way to, because they can read between the lines, you know. But you know.
Speaking of reading between the lines, the most creative recommendation letter that I ever wrote was from D. Emma Johnson.
Oh, yeah. I wrote one kind of like that for a student one time.
The first part of the sentence is like glowing, and then you have something, you know, like really good, and then something that could be taken either way. And if you fold it, certainly, and down in the very bottom, you say, please fold at such and such a mark. And like this employee is worthless, you know. I did it as a joke.
Right, as a joke, yeah.
I actually was the only person in our department who would agree to write for a student who was really obstreperous. And so
There's an English word for it.
I wrote a very short letter that could be, it was like something from Hamlet where you were supposed to read it the other way. But I knew this was a student who would try to get a hold of a copy of it. So I wrote it so that I could, it was weird. It was very weird.
Right.
I wouldn't have done it except no one else would write a letter.
Right.
And I probably had a little more sympathy for her than anyone.
Right. Yeah.
The other thing I've always thought on that question of sharing the letters, I generally don't. Now, I might after they got into graduate school or when they got their degree.
Yeah.
Right.
But you know, when I was an undergrad and applying for post-baccalaureate stuff, I had a professor write a letter for me and went into extreme detail on one particular research project. So I'd go to the interview, and their question was about one source in the bibliography in that paper.
Oh,
And I took it with me to the interview, but I didn't read it over that night before.
wow.
So if I mention something in detail, I usually tell the student that I did, like you might get an interview
That's a great
question on
tip.
this
Yeah.
because
because
I talked at length about this in the letter.
That's a really good tip. Yeah. I'm glad it's still recording because people need to hear that tip.
Yeah.
That was an unusual case, but I've never forgotten it.
Can we get any chance encountered anyone from law school about law school letters recommendations? Those are slightly different beasts.
Yeah, I haven't because I mean, you know, most of the when I hear from graduates, like when they do presentations, it's always graduate schools because
Yeah.
that's what the McNair community is.
Right,
So
right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that Berkeley website may help a little bit, but it may be worth you just calling, OU Law School and say, I'm a professor, I have students that are applying for your program, what kinds of things are you looking for in your
Yeah.
students?
Okay.
Yeah, and they don't want to read letters that don't fit,
Right.
You
Yeah.
know,
and I don't want to waste
either.
their time. Right.
right, and you don't want
Yeah.
to waste their time, so.
Yeah.
What I have found is that graduate schools are very open to talk about those kinds of things because they want good applications. They don't want to waste their
Right.
time
Exactly.
reading
Yeah.
through junk. And that's why they come and talk to students about personal statements, and they come and they talk to them about what, what to put on your CV and what not to put on your CV, those types of things. It's interesting. Sometimes you'll read a personal statement and it's a student that you know really well, and you're like, oh, like, I had no idea, and then that makes you even more like, yes, you need to go to graduate school, because all of this you overcome or whatever. So, Other questions? All right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's good.
Very good.
Kim, I know that you do this, but I have a feeling that oftentimes students